The stone floor was the last honest thing I ever felt. It was cold, damp, and smelled of centuries of standing water. I remember pressing my cheek against it, feeling the grit of the mortar digging into my skin. It is strange what the mind focuses on when the end begins. I did not think of my duty to the throne, or the archives I had left unsealed, or the woman whose face I can no longer quite reconstruct. I thought about the cold. I wanted to tell the acolyte that the floor was too cold for a holy site, that we should rise and light the braziers. But my mouth would not open. The paralytic toxin had already done its work, turning my limbs into heavy, useless deadweight. I was a statue, toppled in the dark, conscious, staring at the boots of the men I had come to interrogate. I had been arrogant. That is the first sin, and usually the last. I was Erasmus Vane, a scholar of the forbidden, a man who believed that knowledge was a shield. I thought I could walk into this nest of heretics, speak the Emperor's law, and they would tremble. I did not understand that they were not waiting to be judged. They were waiting for an ingredient. The chanting began low, a vibrational hum that seemed to originate from the walls themselves rather than the throats of the hooded figures surrounding me. It was a distortion of High Gothic, the holy syllables chewed up and spat out backwards, greased with a language that made my teeth ache. I tried to command my hand to move to reach for the pistol at my belt, but I was merely a passenger in a vessel that had ceased to obey. The leader of the circle stepped forward. I knew him. I had broken bread with him 2 cycles ago. He had a kind face, then a face that smiled when he spoke of the imperial truth. Now, in the flickering light of candles, made from rendered human fat, his face was a mask of ecstatic purpose. He held a dagger, not a weapon of war, but a surgical tool of obsidian glass. It did not reflect the light. It swallowed it. He looked down at me, not with hatred, but with the clinical detachment of a butcher inspecting a prime cut. He leaned close, his breath smelling of copper and rot. He whispered that I was chosen. He said it was an honor. They always call it an honor when they strip you of your humanity. The pain was not what I expected. I anticipated the sharp bite of the blade, the tearing of skin. But the ritual was not about the flesh. The obsidian knife did not just cut the skin, it severed the anchor. When he drove the blade into my chest, I did not feel the steel entering my heart. I felt a hook sinking into the center of my being, catching on something intangible, something wet and heavy that I didn't know I carried. He twisted the blade. The world didn't go black. It went white, a blinding, searing white that tasted like battery acid and old iron. I tried to scream, but the sound stayed inside, echoing in a throat that was rapidly becoming irrelevant. They began to pull. It was a physical sensation, like being dragged through a hole much too small for my shoulders. I felt my soul stretching, thinning out like taffy. The connection to my nerves, to the sensation of the cold floor, snapped one by one. I lost the feeling of my toes, then my fingers, then the heavy thudding of my own heart. It was a terrifying liberation. I was floating, untethered, drifting upward into the smoke and the grease. I looked down. I saw a man lying on the floor. He looked surprised. His eyes were wide, staring at the ceiling mouth, slightly open in a silent gasp. A pool of dark red was expanding beneath him, ruining his fine velvet coat. It took me a long, agonizing second to realize that the meat on the floor was me. I was not allowed to linger. The pull intensified. The chanting reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of guttural sounds that acted like a vacuum. I was being siphoned. The destination was not the warp, not yet. It was something smaller, something harder. On the altar above my corpse sat a sword. It was an ugly thing forged of dark metal that seemed to weep oil. In the pommel, a single cloudy gemstone pulsed with a hungry rhythm. I fought. I thrashed with spiritual limbs clawing at the air, begging the Emperor, begging anyone to let me die. Death would have been a mercy. Death is silence. This was not death. This was relocation. The compression was absolute. Imagine the pressure of an ocean, the weight of a collapsing star, all focused on your consciousness. I was shoved, folded, and crammed into a space no larger than a thumb. The vastness of my mind, my memories of sunlight, the taste of wine, the smell of old paper, all of it was crushed into a singularity of pure panic. The transition ended with a slam, a psychic door slamming shut with the finality of a coffin lid. The white light vanished, replaced by a suffocating red-tinted darkness. The cold floor was gone. The pain of the knife was gone. There was only the sensation of rigid, immovable walls pressing in on every side. I tried to breathe. I had no lungs. I tried to blink. I had no eyelids. Panic, raw and animalistic, flooded what was left of my mind. I screamed a psychic wail that should have shattered glass, but here in this prison, it was nothing but a ripple in a stagnant pond. I was trapped. I was contained. I could see, but not with eyes. My vision was distorted, a spherical fisheye view of the room I had just left. I saw the cultists from a high angle. I saw them wiping their knives. I saw them dragging my body, my empty, useless body, away by the heels. I wanted to reach out to grab my own hand, to climb back into the warmth of my flesh. But I was static. I was an object. Then came the realization, slow and creeping like frost. I was not alone in the dark. The sword was not empty. As the initial shock of the binding settled, I felt the presence. It was beneath me, or perhaps around me, a vast, sleeping ocean of malice. It was dormant, sluggish, but I could feel its heat. It was like sleeping next to a furnace that had just been turned off, but was ready to roar back to life. It knew I was there. I felt a ripple of amusement, not in words, but in pure emotion wash over me. It was tasting me. It was savoring my terror. I focused on the room outside to keep from going mad. The leader of the cult approached the altar. He reached out a hand I had once shaken, and grasped the hilt of the sword. I felt the touch. It was revolting. I felt the sweat on his palm, the warmth of his blood, the chaotic rhythm of his pulse. It wasn't my skin feeling it. It was the metal. I was the metal. The sensation violated me, intimate and gross. He lifted me. The room tilted. For the first time, I saw the world not as a man, but as a weapon. "Beautiful," he whispered. I heard him not through ears, but through the vibrations traveling up the blade. His voice was a tremor in my very structure. "The binding is complete." I wanted to weep. I wanted to vomit. I wanted to die. But I could do none of these things. I could only exist. I was Erasmus Vane. I repeated the name over and over in the claustrophobic dark. I am Erasmus Vane. I am a servant of the throne. I am a man. But the lie tasted like ash. I was not a man. I was a battery. I was a prisoner in a cage of crystal and steel, and the key had been thrown into the abyss. The cultist sheathed the sword. The world went dark. True darkness. Not the absence of light, but the absence of space. The scabbard cut off my view, leaving me alone with the heat of the sleeping demon and the echo of my own silent screaming. I waited for sleep, but sleep belongs to the living. I waited for madness, but madness is a mercy the warp does not grant easily. I waited. That was all there was left to do. The silence stayed. It wasn't peace. It was the holding of breath before the scream. Darkness is a concept that living men misunderstand. When you close your eyes, you see the afterimages of light, the static of your own optic nerves, the faint reddish hue of blood circulating through your eyelids. You are never truly in the dark. But inside the scabbard, inside the gem, the darkness was absolute. It was a physical weight, a liquid shadow that filled every corner of my consciousness. I had no eyelids to close, no hands to wave in front of a face I no longer possessed. I was simply a point of awareness, suspended in a void of infinite black. At first, I thought I had gone blind. I tried to force my eyes to dilate to catch some stray photon, but there was no machinery left to obey the command. I was a camera lens capped and thrown into a deep ocean trench. The silence was worse. It wasn't the quiet of a library or a tomb. Those places have the settling of dust, the creaking of wood. This was the silence of a vacuum. It pressed against me thick and suffocating, demanding that I fill it with my own madness. Time began to dissolve. Without a heartbeat to mark the seconds, without the rhythm of breathing, to measure the minute's duration became a meaningless abstraction. Had I been in the scabbard for an hour, a day, a century, I tried to count. 1, 2, 3. I reached 1,000, then lost the thread as a wave of panic washed over me. I started again. 1, 2. It was futile. The panic was a cold creature. It coiled around where my chest used to be, squeezing phantom lungs. I felt the desperate urge to gasp for air, a biological imperative screaming at me to breathe, breathe, breathe. But there was no air. There was no mouth. I was drowning in dry land, eternally asphyxiating, but never dying. I thrashed against the walls of my prison, hurling my will against the barrier, but it was like a ghost fighting a glacier. I was static. I was frozen. I was a scream trapped in amber. To keep from unraveling, I tried to reconstruct the world I had lost. I built a palace of memory in the void. I summoned the smell of the archivum, the dust of 10,000 years, the sharp tang of preservation chemicals, the dry vanilla scent of old vellum. I focused on it until I could almost taste the paper on my tongue. I thought of my desk, the specific grain of the wood under my fingertips, the stain of ink near the inkwell. I thought of Lita, my daughter. I tried to picture her face. I saw the curve of her jaw, the way she frowned when she was reading the smudge of graphite she always had on her left cheek. I held on to that image like a drowning man, clutching a piece of driftwood. Lita. Lita. I repeated her name into the silence, but the void was corrosive. It ate at the edges of the image. Her eyes blurred. Her voice, which I tried to replay in my mind, sounded distant, distorted, like a Vox recording played underwater. The darkness didn't just hide things, it erased them. Then I noticed the other thing. In my frantic attempt to simulate life, I had ignored the reality of my new existence. I was not alone in this cell. I had been too busy screaming to listen, but now, in the exhaustion of my defeat, I felt it. Below me, or perhaps inside me, something was sleeping. It was the presence I had sensed during the ritual, but now, in the intimacy of the scabbard, it was undeniable. It felt massive, a coiled leviathan slumbering in the deep. It didn't breathe air, but it respired in waves of psychic heat. I could feel its dreams. They were not human dreams. They were jagged flashes of color, sickly purples, and bruised crimsons, and sensations of tearing, biting, and swallowing. It was a demon, a thing of the warp bound to the blade long before I arrived. I was a gnat trapped in a cage with a sleeping tiger. The terror of this realization brought a new kind of clarity. I stopped trying to remember the smell of paper. I became very, very still. I pulled my consciousness into the tightest knot possible, trying to make myself small, trying to hide in a room with no corners. I listened to its heartbeat. It was a slow tectonic rhythm thump. Thump. Each beat sent a vibration through the crystal, a ripple of malice that tasted like copper and ozone. It was ancient. It was patient. And it was hungry. I realized with a jolt of horror that it wasn't fully asleep. It was aware of me. It was tolerating me the way a shark tolerates a remora, or perhaps the way a diner tolerates the waiting period before a meal. The isolation was no longer empty. It was crowded with the threat of violence. I felt a pressure building in my ears, a high-pitched whine, like the squeal of a failing capacitor. It was the sound of the warp bleeding through the seals, or perhaps the sound of my own mind beginning to fracture. I tried to focus on Leda again, but her face was gone. All I could see in my mind's eye was the pulsing red light of the demon's hunger. The sensory deprivation had stripped away my defenses, leaving me naked before a predator that didn't need eyes to see me. I was locked in a box with a monster, and the box was welded shut. I waited. The silence stretched out thin and taut as a wire. I prayed for the cultist to draw the sword, to let light in, to let pain in. Anything was better than this intimacy with the abomination. I wanted to be used. I wanted to be a weapon. I wanted to kill, if only to drown out the sound of the demon's slow, wet breathing. I realized then that my humanity was not being taken from me by force. I was offering it up as a bribe for relief. I didn't want to be Erasmus Vane anymore. I just wanted the noise in my head to stop. But the silence held. The scabbard held. And in the dark, something shifted, and a voice that was not a voice whispered my name. It knew me, and it was laughing. The end of the darkness came with a scream of metal. It wasn't a human sound. It was the friction of steel against the leather throat of the scabbard. I felt the vibration rattle through my core, a seismic shift that announced the opening of my prison. Light did not return gently. It stabbed. It wasn't the soft, filtered light of the library lamps I was used to. It was harsh, flickering, and red. For a moment, I was blinded by the sheer intensity of input. My eyes were no longer directional. I saw everything at once. I saw the vaulted ceiling dripping with condensation, the stained altar cloth, and the mass of heaving bodies surrounding me. The sensory deprivation had been torture, but the return of sensation was an assault. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, incense, and the copper tang of old blood. It crashed into me, overwhelming filters that no longer existed. I wanted to close my eyes, to flinch, to turn away. But a sword cannot look away. A sword must watch. Then came the touch. It was the most intimate violation I had ever experienced. A hand wrapped around the hilt, my hilt. It was not the firm, disciplined grip of a soldier. It was clammy shaking and slick with grease. I could feel the individual ridges of the fingerprints pressing against the leather wrapping. I could feel the heat of the palm, a moist, feverish warmth that seeped into the metal and by extension into my soul. I knew this man, not by name, but by his nature. He was one of the dregs, a cultist who had spent his life in the sewers worshipping filth. And now, he held me. Me, Erasmus Vane, a man who had dined with planetary governors, a scholar who had worn silk and handled texts worth more than this man's entire lineage. The indignation was a physical pain. I tried to recoil, to make the metal bite his hand, to drop from his grasp. But I was solid. I was obedient. I was an object. He lifted me high. The perspective shifted sickeningly. I looked down at the sea of faces, their eyes wide with madness, chanting a name I refused to learn. Through the contact of his skin, I began to feel more than just his heat. I felt his biology. I felt the frantic rabbit-like flutter of his heart. Thump, 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 thump. It was weak, erratic, fueled by adrenaline and malnourished blood. I felt the spasms in his muscles, the adrenaline flooding his system. He was terrified. He was ecstatic. He was unworthy. The demon deep inside the blade stirred, shifting in its sleep. It sensed the weakness of the wielder, was unimpressed. I felt a wave of sullen disappointment rise from the core of the gem, a silent groan that this vermin was the one chosen to wake us. The eye opens. The cultist shrieked. His voice vibrated through my structure, grating and shrill. He swung me through the air. The motion was clumsy, lacking all grace. I felt the air resistance against the flat of the blade, the sudden vertigo of being thrashed about like a toy. I was a precision instrument in the hands of a brute. He didn't understand the balance, the weight, the lethal potential. He just liked the power he felt holding me. And that was the worst part. I could feel his emotions bleeding into mine, a toxic sludge of pride and petty cruelty. He felt like a god because he held a demon. He didn't know that the demon was looking at him with the same appetite a man looks at a piece of bread. He didn't know that I was in here screaming in silence, disgusted by the sweat that was soaking into my new body. He lowered the blade, pointing the tip toward the shadows of the corridor. Others were moving there. Not cultists, enforcement, the enemy, my former allies. I recognized the gray fatigues of the Planetary Defense Force, a flicker of hope. No, not hope, just habit flared in me. They would save me. They would take the sword, contain it, and maybe free me. But then the cultist tightened his grip, his fear spiked sharp and acidic. "Kill them," he whispered. "Kill them for the Dark King." The command wasn't for me, but the intent washed over me. The diamond woke up. It didn't wake fully, just one eye opening in the deep. It smelled the prey. It pushed against my mind, not with words, but with an urge. Forward, it commanded. Feed. The cultist charged. I was just the tip of the spear hurtling toward men I had sworn to protect, held by a hand I wanted to sever. I wasn't the wielder. I was the ammunition. The distance between the sword tip and the soldier's throat closed in a fraction of a second. Yet to me, it felt like an epoch. I saw the trooper's face with agonizing clarity. He was a boy, no older than 20, with a smudge of grease on his chin, and eyes wide with the realization of his own mortality. I knew the uniform. I knew the regulations that governed the way he held his lasgun. I wanted to scream a warning. I wanted to twist in the cultist's grip, to turn the flat of the blade, and deliver a non-lethal blow. But I was not the driver. I was the vehicle. The cultist's swing was clumsy, a wild haymaker born of desperation. But as the edge neared the flesh, something changed. The weight of the sword shifted on its own. The demon corrected the angle. The clumsiness vanished, replaced by a predatory precision. We didn't just strike, we sought. The impact was not the jarring clash of metal I expected. It was shockingly soft. The blade bit into the flak armor, and for a microsecond, there was resistance, the stubbornness of ceramic and weave. Then it gave way. Passing through the armor, through the skin and into the muscle, felt like sliding a hot spoon into ice cream. It was smooth. It was frictionless. I felt the specific density of the collarbone as it parted. I felt the hot, pressurized spray of the carotid artery bursting against my steel skin. It wasn't just a tactile sensation, it was a flood of data. I felt the temperature of his blood, the oxygen content, the adrenaline spiking in his dying system. I was submerged in the sudden, wet reality of violence. And God Emperor help me, it felt warm. The cold of the void, the freezing silence of the scabbard, it was all washed away by this torrent of heat. Then the drinking began. This was the secret the Inquisition warns you about, the truth that drives men mad. The sword didn't just cut meat, it severed the metaphysical cord. As the boy's life faded, I felt a suction, a vortex opening at the core of the gem. The demon inhaled. It wasn't breathing air. It was inhaling the soul. I felt the boy's essence being pulled through the metal, rushing through my consciousness, like water through a pipe. I saw flashes of his life, the smell of wreck calf in a mess hall, the rough texture of a letter from home, the fear of the dark. Then they were consumed. The demon swallowed them whole, and the energy exploded outward. It wasn't pain, it was euphoria. It was the most intense pleasure I have ever known. It dwarfed the satisfaction of a solved riddle or the warmth of a lover's touch. It was a rush of golden electric power that filled the hollow spaces of my soul. For a moment, I wasn't trapped. I wasn't a victim. I was a god. The fear vanished. The claustrophobia vanished. I felt strong, vibrant, alive. I drank the boy's death like a vintage wine, savoring the sweetness of his terror. The demon purred a deep, satisfied rumble that vibrated through the lattice of the sword, and I purred with it. We were united in the feast. I didn't want it to stop. I wanted more. I wanted to drain the entire world dry, if it meant I never had to feel the cold again. The body hit the floor with a wet thud, breaking the connection. The flow of energy cut off, leaving me trembling in the sudden silence. The euphoria receded, leaving behind a residue of oil and ash. The reality crashed back in. I had just murdered a loyal servant of the throne. I had eaten him. The cultist was laughing a breathless, hysterical cackle, swinging me around, spraying droplets of the boy's life onto the walls. "Blood for the gods," he shrieked. I wanted to vomit. I wanted to scrub the blood from my surface. I felt dirty, violated, stained in a way that no prayer could cleanse. But underneath the guilt, underneath the horror of what I had become, there was a small, quiet voice in the back of my mind. It was my voice, and it was asking, "When can we eat again?" That was the true damnation. It wasn't the killing. It was the hunger. The silence returned, but now it was hungry too. It wasn't mercy. It was an addiction. The cultist did not last long. His fanaticism was infinite, but his biology was disappointingly finite. A bolt round a mass-reactive shell the size of a fist found him in the chest. There was no pain, no scream, just immediate hydraulic ruin. One moment I was swinging through the air, carving through smoke and shadow. The next, the hand holding me evaporated into a mist of red vapor and bone shards. I fell. The world spun in a dizzying blur of gray floor and ceiling until I struck the deck plating with a deafening clang. I slid across the metal, coming to rest in a pool of oil and cooling blood. The silence returned, but it was different this time. It wasn't the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of a battlefield holding its breath before the Titan speaks. I lay there, vibrating slightly from the impact, staring up at the smoke-choked air, wondering if I would be left here to rust. Then the floor began to shake. It wasn't the vibration of machinery, but the rhythmic thud of footsteps so heavy they registered as small earthquakes. Thud, thud, thud. Something massive was approaching. I saw a boot, dark red and trimmed with brass, slam down inches from my hilt. It was the size of a child's torso. The ground groaned under the weight. I looked up figuratively, as I had no neck to crane, and saw a mountain of ceramite and hatred towering over me. A Chaos Space Marine, a traitor from the legions of old. He did not look like a man. He looked like a walking tank, a monument to war constructed from meat and metal. The servos in his armor whined a sound like dying wolves as he bent down. A gauntlet articulated and thick as a blast door reached for me. When the cultist held me, I felt his sweat, his trembling fear. When this giant grasped the hilt, I felt nothing but absolute crushing certainty. The grip was immovable. He didn't just hold me, he locked me into place. I felt the magnetic clamps in his palm engage, bonding me to his armor. I was no longer a sword held by a man. I was an extension of a fusion-powered killing machine. The sheer power radiating from him was intoxicating and terrifying. I could feel the hum of his power pack vibrating through the blade, a constant low-frequency growl that harmonized with the demon inside me. The demon woke fully now, not with a sleepy stretch, but with a snap of attention. It recognized a peer. The connection to his mind was instantaneous and violent. If the cultist's mind was a muddy puddle of fear and superstition, this creature's mind was a nuclear reactor. I was slammed with a wall of discipline, hatred, and tactical data. I saw the battlefield through his auto-senses. I saw targeting reticules overlaying the world, turning living men into wireframe ghosts to be dismantled. I heard the chatter of the Vox grill, a stream of binary and battle cont that sounded like rocks grinding together. He didn't think in words. He thought in trajectories and kill counts and theological axioms of slaughter. I tried to pull back to shield my own fragile consciousness from this inferno, but there was nowhere to hide. He raised me high, and for the first time, I felt the true purpose of the weapon I had become. He didn't swing me. He propelled me. Lorgar smiles, he rumbled. His voice was a tectonic shift, deep enough to rattle my molecular structure. He wasn't fighting for survival. He was fighting as an act of worship. As we marched forward into the smoke, crushing the bodies of the fallen under sabatons that weighed tons, I realized the scale of my damnation. I wasn't just a murderer anymore. I was an instrument of genocide. The cultist killed for a cause he barely understood. This monster killed because it was the only way he knew how to pray. And as we charged the demon, and the giant began to sing a song of ruin in my mind, and I was too small, too weak to do anything but hum along. The transition was not physical. It was ontological. When a ship translates from real space into the Imperium, the universe hiccups. I felt it as a sudden inversion of gravity, a sensation like my stomach phantom organ, that it was being pulled out through my non-existent mouth. The giant had magnetized me to his hip, walking through the vaulted, dripping corridors of his strike cruiser. The metal of the ship screamed. It wasn't the stress of torque or thrust. It was the metal itself protesting the violation of natural law. We were piercing the veil. We were diving into the sea of souls. For a man with a body, the Geller field provides a bubble of reality, a thin skin of logic protecting him from the insanity outside. But I was no longer a man. I was a conduit. I was a radio receiver tuned to the frequency of hell, and someone had just cranked the volume to the maximum. The walls of the ship dissolved. Not literally, the giant still walked on steel decking, but to my witch sight, the architecture became fluid. I looked at a bulkhead and saw a face weeping oil. I looked at a rivet and saw a dying sun. The senses I had relied on, the cold, tactile feedback of the sword, began to bleed into one another. Synesthesia is a clinical term for a neurological condition, but here it was the baseline of existence. I could hear the color purple. It sounded like a dentist's drill boring into a molar, a high-pitched whining shriek that grated against my soul. I could taste the light from the glow globes. It tasted like spoiled milk and copper. The sensory input was a deluge of nonsense, a chaotic storm of data that refused to resolve into a coherent picture. I tried to shut it out, to retreat into the dark, but there is no dark in the warp. There is only the light that burns. Time, already a fragile concept in my imprisonment, shattered completely. I watched a drop of condensation fall from a pipe. It took a year to hit the floor. In that year, I lived 1,000 lifetimes of boredom and terror. Then, in the blink of an eye, the giant walked a mile. The linearity of cause and effect was gone. I remembered things that hadn't happened yet. I forgot things that had just occurred. My name. I tried to say it. Eras. It felt slippery, like a wet bar of soap sliding out of my mental grip. What was the rest, Erasmus? Yes, Erasmus Vane. But who was he? Was he the man in the library? Or was he the man screaming in the crystal? The memory of my face began to rot, the features melting like wax under a blowtorch. I panicked. I scrambled through the archives of my mind, frantically trying to catalog my own history, but the pages were blank. Then came the whispers. They didn't come from the demon inside me. They came from outside, pressing against the hull of the ship, sliding through the Geller field like smoke. They were the Neverborn. They knew I was fresh meat. Look at us, they hissed. The sound was like dry leaves skittering on pavement. We have such sights to show you, little thing. We have your daughter's eyes. We have your father's disappointment. I felt them scratching at the crystal of the gem, testing the seals. They wanted in. They wanted to crack the shell and slurp out the marrow of my ego. I huddled against the burning heat of the demon within, preferring the monster I knew to the infinite monsters outside. The demon, for its part, was amused. It purred a deep, vibrating rhythm that acted as a shield, not out of kindness, but out of possessiveness. I was its toy, and it did not share. The giant stopped walking. He knelt in his sanctum, surrounded by skulls, etched with runes that hurt to look at. He began to chant, his voice a deep drone that harmonized with the screaming purple of the warp. The vibration traveled through his armor, through the magnet, and into me. It was a lullaby of madness. The ship shuddered, riding the currents of the great ocean. Outside the hull, I knew there were things the size of continents swimming in the ether. Things that looked like geometry gone wrong. Things that looked like love and hate fused into a single biting mouth. I stopped trying to understand. Understanding was a liability. To understand the warp is to let it in. So I focused on the only thing that was real, the cold, hard hate of the Space Marine. It was an anchor. It was a rock in the storm. I clung to his hatred because it was the only thing that made sense. I didn't know how long we would be here. A day, a century, it didn't matter. In the warp, forever is just a Tuesday. And I was already late. We made planetfall not on a world of rock and soil, but on a scab, healing over a wound in reality. The airlock hissed open, and the atmosphere that flooded in didn't smell like air. It smelled like cinnamon and rotting meat. The giant stepped out onto the surface, and the ground squelched beneath his boots. I looked through the psychic sensors of the blade and saw that the grass was made of hair and the trees were calcified veins stretching up into a sky that looked like a bruised eye. This was a demon world. Here, gravity was a suggestion, and the laws of physics were rewritten by the whims of insane gods. The giant drew me from the scabbard. The sound was sharp, a clear note of violence that cut through the humid, muttering air. He didn't draw me for defense. He drew me for the game. The headache started immediately. It wasn't a biological ache. I had no brain to throb. It was a pressure on the concept of self. The demon inside the sword woke up with a roar of anticipation. We were in the Imperium's backyard now, and it wanted to stretch. It wanted to see. It pushed against my consciousness, trying to shove me into the background, to relegate me to the role of a silent passenger while it drove the vehicle. It felt like a hot, wet hand, squeezing my mind. I tried to retreat to my sanctuary, the memory of the archivum, but the demon followed me there. I closed my eyes in the dream, visualizing the endless rows of books, the smell of dust, the safety of knowledge. But the books were bleeding. The ink was running down the pages like black tears, and the shelves were burning with a fire that gave off no heat, only cold, mocking light. "Get out of my head," I screamed into the void. The words had no sound, but they had force. I built a wall of will. I used my arrogance, my stubborn pride as an inquisitorial agent. I told myself that I was Erasmus Vane, and I was superior to this filth. The demon laughed a sound, like tearing canvas, and slammed against my mental defenses. Outside, the giant was fighting. He was carving through enemies that defied description geometry, that screamed colors that bit. He swung me in wide, devastating arcs. I felt the edge slice through things that felt like jelly, then things that felt like diamond. The physical impact shuddered through me, jarring my concentration, weakening my hold on the eyes of the sword. The demon used every impact to hammer at my resolve. Mine it hissed, my eyes, my kill. "This is my prison," I retorted, channeling every ounce of hatred I had for my captors into a psychic spike. I drove it into the demon's mass. It recoiled. For a second, the burning library stabilized. I saw the battlefield clearly. We were standing on a plateau of bone. The sky was raining teeth. The giant was a blur of motion, a red dynamo of slaughter shouting praises to the dark gods. He was fighting entities of blue flame and shifting glass minions of the Changer of Ways. It was the great game, the eternal war between the chaos gods. And I was the playing piece. I realized then that if I let go, if I let the demon take the wheel, I would never get it back. I would dissolve. I would become just another facet of the sword's malice. I held on. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. It was harder than the torture of the binding, harder than the isolation. It was an active, muscular effort of the soul. I imagined my will as a vice, clamping down on the vision, refusing to blink. The demon raged. It flooded my mind with images of despair, my corpse rotting on the floor, my daughter forgetting my name, the Imperium burning. I looked at the images and acknowledged them. Yes, I am dead. Yes, I am forgotten. But I am still here. I will not submit, I whispered to the burning books. The giant struck a final thunderous blow against a tower of crystal. It shattered with a sound like a choir screaming in reverse. The immediate threat was gone. The giant stood amidst the ruined chest, heaving steam rising from his armor. The pressure in my mind receded, leaving me feeling hollowed out, scraped clean like a bowl. The demon sulked back into the depths of the gem, denied its total victory, but it had taken a toll. My memory of the library was scorched. The edges of the books were charred. I felt thin stretched over a frame that was too large for me. The giant sheathed me. The darkness returned, but it wasn't a relief. It was just a different kind of weight. I had won the battle for my eyes, but I knew the war was far from over. I wondered in the quiet dark if I could use this creature, if I could harness its hunger. Or was that just another lie I told myself to keep from screaming? The silence offered no answer. Only the taste of ash remained. Time didn't pass. It eroded. In the material world, cliffs are worn down by the sea over millennia. In the sword, my soul was the cliff, and the war was the sea. The distinct battles, the campaigns on ice worlds, the sieges of hive cities, the boarding actions in the void began to bleed together into a single gray smear of violence. I stopped counting the years after the first century. Or maybe it was the first decade. It is impossible to tell. The giant who wielded me was ageless, a constant variable in an equation of slaughter. He marched, he killed, he prayed, and he marched again. I became a passenger on a carousel of carnage that never stopped spinning. The excitement of the kill, the horror of the feast, even the revulsion, it all faded. It was replaced by a dull, aching monotony. I remember standing in the rain. We were waiting for a breach charge to detonate. The rain drummed against the scabbard. Tap, tap, tap. It was the only sound in the universe. I tried to remember the feeling of rain on skin. I knew it was supposed to be cold. I knew it was supposed to make you shiver, but I couldn't feel it. I could only hear the impact on the metal plating. I tried to summon the memory of being wet, of being cold, but the file was corrupted. The sensation was just a word, wet. It had no texture. It had no emotional weight. I was a library where the books were turning to dust, the ink fading until the pages were blank. I wasn't living. I was just recording data that I could no longer interpret. Then came the hunger. It changed. In the beginning, the thirst for souls was the demon's vice, a shameful addiction I fought against. Now it was a necessity. Without the influx of life energy, my mind felt brittle, like dried parchment ready to crumble. I needed the kill not for pleasure, but for clarity. When the blade finally shore through the blast door and bit into the defenders inside, the rush of blood was like a jolt of electricity to a failing cogitator. The warmth flooded me, and for a few precious seconds the gray fog lifted. Colors became sharp. I remembered the color blue. I remembered the concept of mercy even as we butchered them. But the clarity brought its own horror. During a raid on a pilgrim transport, the giant cornered a woman. She was cowering beneath a row of seats, clutching a holy icon. She looked up, terror etched into her features. And for a heartbeat, I didn't see a stranger. I saw her. My wife. I saw the curve of her cheekbone, the specific shade of her eyes. My heart, my phantom, non-existent heart lurched. No, I screamed in the silence. Not her. Anyone but her. I threw my will against the giant's arm, trying to turn the blade to dull the edge. But I was weak. I was hollow. The blade descended. It wasn't her. As the soul passed through me, I tasted the truth. Her name was not Ilara. She was a manufacturing worker from a star system I had never visited. The face I had seen was a hallucination, a projection of my own desperate need to see something familiar. I had pasted the face of my beloved onto a dying stranger because I was forgetting what my beloved actually looked like. The realization broke me more than the killing did. I was losing them. Lita, Ilara. Their faces were becoming masks that I could slip onto anyone. I drank the woman's life, and instead of guilt, I felt a sullen gratitude. I used her death to patch the holes in my memory, cementing the image of my wife for a few more days. The war continued. It always did. The giant cleaned the blade with a ragged cloth, humming a discordant tune that grated on my nerves. I hated that sound. Now I waited for it. It was the only constant. I retreated into the gem, curling around the demon, like a child seeking warmth from a wolf. We were both tired. We were both old. The screaming of the dying became a lullaby. I drifted in the dark, clutching the stolen memories of 1,000 dead strangers, wondering which ones were mine and which ones were just debris. Was I Erasmus Vane, or was I just the consciousness of the sword dreaming that it was once a man? The rain started again. Tap, tap, tap. I stopped listening. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered but the next drink. The battlefield was a blur of gray ash and muzzle flashes until the color cut through the gloom like a laser. Blue. Cobalt blue trimmed with gold. It was a color I hadn't seen in centuries, a color that belonged to a universe of order and law. A space marine of the Ultramarines. Chapter stood amidst the wreckage of a rhino transport, his stormbolter barking a rhythmic staccato of death. He was magnificent. To the giant holding me, this was just another obstacle, another trophy to be claimed. But to me, he was an angel. He was the Emperor's judgment made manifest. For the first time since the binding, the cold knot of despair in my center loosened. I didn't feel fear. I felt a desperate, clawing hope. If he destroyed the host, if he shattered the blade, I would be free. Oblivion was better than this. The giant roared a challenge that shook the ruins and charged. The ultramarine turned his movements precise and fluid. He didn't carry a chainsword. He wielded a power sword that hummed with a clean blue energy field. We collided. The impact was like two meteors striking. The demon inside me shrieked in anticipation, eager to feast on the soul of a demigod. But I fought back. For the first time, I didn't just ride the wave. I tried to be the anchor. As the giant swung me toward the ultramarine's neck, I threw every ounce of my will against the motion. Miss, I screamed. Slowed down. Fail. It was like trying to stop a falling building with a thought. The swing didn't stop, but it stuttered. A microsecond of hesitation. It was enough. The ultramarine parried. His blade crashed against mine. The energy fields flared white-hot. I felt the purity of his weapon burning against my corrupted skin. It hurt. It was a searing, cleansing pain that felt like forgiveness. Destroy me, I wailed into the psychic ether. I am here. I am Erasmus Vane. Break me. I projected my consciousness outward, trying to bridge the gap between our minds. I wanted him to sense the prisoner within the weapon. I wanted him to know that he wasn't fighting a demon, but a man held hostage. I saw his lenses flare as he locked eyes with the giant. He parried again, stepping inside the guard. He was winning. My sabotage was working. The giant grunted in surprise as the blade felt heavy, unresponsive in his hand. But hope is a cruel thing in the 41st millennium. The ultramarine drove his knee into the giant's midsection, cracking ceramite. He raised his power sword for the killing blow, a downward strike meant to cleave the giant's helm in two. I braced for the end. I welcomed it. I saw the tip of his blade descending, shining like a star. But the giant was not just a warrior. He was a creature of the warp. He didn't rely on the sword alone. With a growl of frustration, he abandoned the duel of blades. He released his grip on me with one hand and punched the ultramarine. It was a blow enhanced by sorcery, a fist wreathed in dark fire. The loyalist flew backward, crashing into a crumbling wall. The giant advanced, raising me high. I felt his anger now. He knew. He sensed the resistance in the weapon. Traitorous steel, he hissed. He didn't swing with finesse this time. He swung with brute, punishing force. I tried to hold back again, but I was exhausted. The demon, enraged by my interference, surged up and crushed my will. We descended. I felt the sickening crunch of the ultramarine's pauldron, then the wet slide into flesh. I didn't drink this time. I refused. I gagged on the soul energy, spitting it out into the void. The ultramarine died, looking at the sword, his eyes behind the lenses fading. He didn't see me. He didn't hear my plea. He just saw a tool of the enemy. The giant wrenched me free, the metal screeching. He didn't sheath me. He looked at the blade at the chip in the edge where the power sword had struck. He looked at me with disgust. Useless, he spat. And the silence returned heavier than before, because now it carried the weight of a salvation that had looked me in the eye and died. The rejection was final. The giant did not return me to the scabbard at his hip. He walked through the bowels of the ship, past the training cages and the torture decks, to a heavy blast door that smelled of ozone and ancient dust. The room beyond was a graveyard of ambition. It was the reliquary, a vault where the Legion stored weapons that were too dangerous, too unruly, or simply too broken to use. He looked at me one last time, his helmet lens reflecting the dull, chipped surface of my blade. There was no ceremony. He simply opened his hand. I fell. I struck a pile of discarded ceramite plates and tangled chain sliding down until I came to rest against a rusted bolter. The blast door slammed shut, sealing the tomb. The darkness was absolute again, but this time the silence did not follow. I had grown used to the silence of the scabbard. It was a cold, lonely thing, but it was mine. This place was not silent. At first it sounded like the hum of the ship's engines, a low, throbbing vibration in the air. But as my senses adjusted to the gloom, the sound resolved into something far worse. It was whispering. Thousands of voices overlapping, interrupting and screaming over one another. The pile of junk I rested upon was not dead metal. It was a mass grave of trapped souls. Every sword, every shield, every cracked helmet in the room contained a spark of consciousness, a remnant of someone who had been bound just like me. And they were all insane. Fire. The fire is in the vents, a voice shrieked, repeating the loop every 3 seconds. It came from a flamer unit buried somewhere to my left. My eyes. Where are my eyes? Sobbed a chain axe near the ceiling. Coordinates locked. Target acquired. Coordinates locked. Target acquired droned a targeting array over and over, a mechanical mantra of a machine that had forgotten its war. It was a cacophony of misery. They were not talking to each other. They were broadcasting their trauma into the void, an endless swirling storm of psychic noise. I tried to pull back to retreat into the gem, but the noise was pervasive. It vibrated through the metal of the blade. It scratched at the walls of my mind. It was like standing in a crowded room where everyone is screaming their own name at the top of their lungs. Quiet, I shouted into the ether. For the love of the throne, be quiet. My psychic voice rippled through the pile. For a heartbeat, the whispering stopped. 1,000 points of awareness turned their attention toward me. I felt their gaze wet, hungry, and vacant. Then the noise returned, louder than before. New Meat whispered a dagger made of bone. He remembers his name, giggled a shield covered in flayed skin. He thinks he's real. They didn't want conversation. They wanted confirmation of their own existence. They clawed at my mind, sharing their memories unbidden. I suddenly tasted ash. I felt the sensation of drowning. I felt the recoil of a gun that wasn't there. Their madness leaked into me, diluting my own. I tried to focus on the demon. I tried to wake it to ask it to shield me, but the demon was dormant, sluggish from the lack of blood. It slept deep in the core, indifferent to the chatter of the lesser spirits. I was alone in the crowd. I found myself listening to the bolter next to me. It was muttering a prayer to the Emperor over and over, but the words were wrong. It was mixing the liturgy with a recipe for corpse starch. The Emperor protects the salt. The light of Terra boils the water. It was grotesque. It was pathetic. And it was terrifying because I understood it. I felt the fraying edges of my own mind beginning to harmonize with the noise. Days turned into weeks, or perhaps years. In the dark, with only the chorus of the damned for company time became a flat circle of torment. I started to lose track of which thoughts were mine. Was I the one afraid of the fire? No, that was the flamer. Was I the one looking for my eyes? No, that was the axe. But surely I was the one praying. I tried to recite the litany of hate I had learned as an inquisitor, but the words were slippery. The alien, the mutant, the salt. That wasn't right. I laughed. It was a dry mental sound. The bolter stopped muttering and seemed to listen. Welcome, it whispered. We are the choir. And I realized with a final jolt of horror that I wasn't fighting the noise anymore. I was adding to it. I started to hum. It was the only way to be heard. Madness is not a sudden snap. It is a long, slow grinding of the gears until the teeth are stripped away. In the cacophony of the reliquary, I was becoming smooth. The jagged edges of my personality, the sharp corners of my morality, they were being worn down by the endless friction of 1,000 screaming souls. I lay in the dark, vibrating with the noise, wishing for the ability to weep. Tears would have been a release. Tears imply a reservoir of feeling that can be emptied. But I was dry. I was a husk of crystal and wire, echoing the screams of a flamer unit that thought it was burning its own children. Erasmus, I whispered. The word sounded foreign. It was a collection of sounds that no longer pointed to a person. It was just another noise in the pile. Then the silence returned. It didn't come from outside. The reliquary was still a storm of wailing ghosts. The silence bloomed from within. It started at the core of the gem, an expanding sphere of absolute heavy quiet that pushed the madness away. It was the demon. For years, for centuries, it had been a beast, a thing of hunger and rage. But now, as I lay broken on the heap of scrap, it approached me differently. It didn't roar. It didn't bite. It seeped into the cracks of my mind like warm syrup. It felt heavy, comforting, and undeniably ancient. It was the first time it had offered me anything other than pain. "You are tired, little scholar," the voice said. It wasn't spoken. It was remembered. It felt like a thought I had always had, finally surfacing. You hold on to a ghost. You carry a corpse on your back and call it a name. With a question hung in the stillness. Why? Why was I fighting? I looked at the mental image of Erasmus Vane, the robes, the rosette, the stern face. He looked exhausted. He looked pathetic. He was a man who had died 4,000 years ago, yet I was forcing him to walk through hell. The demon's presence wrapped around me a blanket of obsidian darkness. "Put him down," it whispered. "Let him sleep. You don't need to be him anymore. You can just be." The temptation was physical. It felt like the urge to sleep after being awake for a week. The demon showed me a vision of what it offered. No more isolation. No more being the passenger trapped behind a glass wall while the monster drove. If I stopped fighting, if I opened the door, the wall would vanish. We would not be two things, a man and a demon stuffed into a sword. We would be one thing. A new thing. The pain of the binding would cease because there would be no me to be bound. There would only be the will of the weapon. No more fear, it promised. No more victimhood. You will not be the one bleeding. You will be the blade. I tried to summon a counter-argument. I tried to rally the catechisms of the Inquisition. Suffer not the witch to live. The Emperor protects. But the Emperor was very far away. He was a golden light on a distant throne, and I was in a dark box at the edge of the universe. The Emperor had not saved me. The Emperor had let me rot. The demon was here. It was warm. It was offering an end to the screaming. I looked at the memory of my daughter one last time. Her face was a blur of gray static. I couldn't remember her voice. I couldn't remember why I loved her. I only remembered that remembering her hurt. "Will it stop?" I asked. My psychic voice was small, trembling like a child's. The noise, the cold. Will it stop? The demon didn't answer with words. It answered with a feeling of immense oceanic calm. It opened its core to me, a vast, dark gravity well. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also inevitable. I was a drop of water trying to hold its shape in the middle of the sea. It was time to fall. I loosened my grip. I stopped reciting my name. I let the walls of my mind dissolve. The barrier between the man and the monster crumbled. The darkness rushed in not to drown me but to fill me. I didn't scream. I sighed. And for the first time in eons, I was not alone. I was complete. The light returned, but it was no longer harsh. It was a beautiful strobing rhythm of explosions and laser fire. We were moving. I felt the muscles of the arm that held us, not his arm, but our arm. The distinction had evaporated. There was no longer a prisoner beating against the glass. There was no glass. I flowed through the circuits of the power armor. I pulsed in the veins of the warrior. When he growled, I felt the vibration in my own throat, even though I had no throat. We were a single organism of ceramic flesh and warp-forged steel designed for one singular holy purpose. The battlefield was not a place of horror. It was a banquet table spread wide and waiting for us to take our seat. A figure in green armor stepped into our path, a loyalist, a defender of the corpse emperor. Once a lifetime ago, I might have felt a pang of kinship. I might have tried to turn the blade. But that part of me was gone, dissolved like sugar in hot water. I looked at him and saw only a container, a sealed vessel full of sweet red nectar. We stepped forward. The movement was fluid, perfect. We swung. The air parted around us with a lover's caress. The impact was exquisite. The chainsword of the loyalist shattered against our edge, the metal crying out in submission. We continued the arc, slicing through the pauldron, through the ribs, through the hearts. The feedback was instantaneous. A rush of vitality, a spark of soul fire that tasted of duty and fear. We drank it. We laughed. The sound came from the helmet's Vox grill, but the humor was entirely mine. More, we whispered. The warrior's thought was my thought. The hunger was a shared ache. We moved through the smoke, seeking the next offering. I found fragments of memories floating in the soup of our consciousness. A library, a woman's face, a name that started with E. They were curious little artifacts like shells found on a beach. I picked them up, examined them, and crushed them. They held no weight. They were the debris of a creature that had been weak, a creature that had been afraid of the dark. I was not afraid of the dark anymore. I was the dark. The shadows were my skin. The screams of the dying were the applause I had waited 4,000 years to hear. We cornered a squad of mortals near a bunker. They raised their lasguns, their hands shaking. I could smell their terror. It was a pungent, spicy aroma that made the gemstone in the hilt pulse with anticipation. Mercy, one of them cried. The word meant nothing. It was a sound from a dead language. We did not offer mercy. We offered evolution. To die by our hand was to be elevated to become fuel for the great machine of the primordial truth. We descended upon them. It was not a fight. It was a harvest. I felt the wet warmth of them splashing against the steel, coating us in a second skin of crimson. It felt right. It felt like coming home. The battle ended, as they always do, with the silence of the butchered. We stood atop a mound of wreckage, the sky bleeding purple above us. The warrior wiped the blade with a cloth, a ritual of care. I felt the cloth snag on a chip in the metal, a scar from a duel I could barely remember. I didn't mind the flaw. It was a mark of history. I settled back into the scabbard, into the warm, comforting embrace of the demon. We were tired, but it was a good tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes after a day of honest work. I tried to recall the question that had plagued me for eons. Who am I? The answer came easily now without the stuttering confusion of the past. I am the edge that cuts. I am the thirst that is never quenched. I am malice. The man who existed before the scholar. The father, the fool. He was just the cocoon. He had to break so I could be born. I rested in the dark, listening to the heartbeat of the galaxy, waiting for the next hand to draw me, the next throat to open. And I was free.